Good afternoon to all those in Europe. Good morning to all those across the Atlantic. I'm Javier Ruperez, and this is the FAES Foundation cycle on 40 years of Spain into NATO, and the fact that in few days' time, the NATO summit will be taking place in Madrid. It was 40 years ago when Spain decided to join NATO, practically to this day. It was May the 30th, 1982. And for Spain, it was a great moment because that was the beginning of our belonging to the West. After 40 years of dictatorship, we had decided to become a full democracy. And that was the first time that democracies considered to be Spain one of theirs. That's a historical moment which has been extremely well received by Spaniards right now, and at the same time, which reflected a situation 40 years ago when, there was a cautious relationship between the two sides, between the two blocs, but at the same time, there was a reality of some degree of stability, some degree of peace. Spain was well received by the then 15 members. We became the 16th member of the alliance, and we've remained a faithful ally all this time. And just to discuss about all these questions within the cycle that is being organized by the FAES Foundation under the direction of President José María Aznar, we would like to go to what is going to happen right now. What is the world right now, 40 years afterwards? What are we? What is the world? And that's the first question I would like to answer to the first of our guests. We have two really significant personalities to talk to us. President José María Aznar, the former president of the Spanish government, and John Bolton, the former national security advisor of the United States. I would like to start with President Aznar. Mr. President, how is the world today? How do you see the world today, 40 years after Spain decided to join NATO?
Thank you very much, all of the people that is connected with us. Thank you very much, Ambassador Ruperez, for your introduction. For me, as my condition as president of FAES Foundation is a very serious challenge. This initiative to commemorate the 40th anniversary to Spain in NATO, because this was a decision very important for our country, and continue to be today. Situation extremely important for today and for the future of our country and the world. But first of all, let me please thanks to Ambassador Bolton. I can express my gratitude to Ambassador Bolton. Thank you very much for your participation. I appreciate very much, Ambassador Bolton. You know very well that we are old friends in several years ago, but we share a lot of views. We share a lot of different initiatives. We share a lot of different battles, a lot of different concerns. And I don't like to contradict and to disobey to our moderator, Ambassador Ruperez, no, but in the condition of our guest, special guest, Ambassador Bolton, the first question that Ambassador Ruperez proposed, I prefer that the start of this meeting was in the words of Ambassador Bolton. Thank you very much, Ambassador Bolton, and we all of us we like to hear from you your vision of how is the world today.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks to FAES for putting this program together. It really is quite significant, and I think, as Ambassador Ruperez said, Spain's joining the NATO alliance marked a significant change for Spain and its participation in the wider diplomacy of not just Europe but the world as a whole. and coming as it did just a few years before the collapse of the Soviet Union, the breakup of the Warsaw Pact, was very important as well. You know, it's amazing to think that 40 years later, NATO is still a vital and important organization. Many people felt in 1991, 1992 that NATO had accomplished its task and would disappear. But it's still here today, and indeed, tragically, because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, playing an even more important role than we could possibly have envisioned, I think, at the end of the Cold War. And a lot remains to be considered about what the outcome in Ukraine is going to be. But at this very moment, even though one European leader just a short time ago said that NATO was brain dead, now we see what to me is almost a miracle that Finland and Sweden have requested to join NATO, something that was inconceivable before February the 24th, but is now essentially a certainty after the normal ratification process goes through. It's another major step forward, and hopefully another step in really trying to secure peace and security in Europe, which was always NATO's main intention. But of course, the world is bigger than the North Atlantic area, and we face significant challenges really around the world. I think the existential challenge for all of us in the 21st century is China. I think we're slow to realize the nature of the challenge that China's posed, but it's becoming increasingly real in all of our lives. It's not just political or military, it's economic as well. China has very long-term planning horizons, which is not necessarily an American virtue, that's for sure. And I think things we have to think about. It calls into question what is the West's relationship with those around the Chinese periphery and the Indo-Pacific, with India, with Southeast Asia, with Japan, with Taiwan, Australia. These are very, very important questions for all of us going forward. And I'm reminded all the time of Jose Maria's suggestion, it's 15 or 16 years ago now, that the future of NATO could rest in large part on making NATO a global organization. You know, in the United States, a lot of people have talked from time to time about their dissatisfaction with the United Nations and said what we really need is a League of Democracies. But actually, we do have a League of Democracies. It's called NATO. And Jose Maria proposed that countries like Japan, Australia, Singapore, Israel, others we could think of, might be invited to join NATO. So I think it's very fitting on the 40th anniversary of Spain's joining NATO, with Finland and Sweden now about to join, hopefully in very short order, with this enormous crisis in Ukraine still to be resolved, that we've demonstrated that NATO really is, I think, the most successful political military alliance in history. And yet it still has a very important future looking at challenges not simply in the North Atlantic, but really around the world.
Ambassador, I basically agree with your points, and that's very obvious. That if we look at what is happening right now, perhaps the only positive up to a point aspects of the Russian aggression against Ukraine is precisely to give a new life to a transatlantic relationship. That's a very positive, and at the end of the day, says it would be excellent to have all these NATO alliance getting together with all those democracies around the world. But what is going to happen with Finland and Sweden if we talk about Turkey? Do you think that Turkey will eventually veto the entrance of the two countries? I can tell you that though the situation is completely different, we are in the south and they are in the north, but we do understand the reasons why the Finns and the Swedes are asking to belong to NATO. Do you think that Turkey will eventually veto that possibility?
No, I don't think so. I think President Erdogan is bargaining for something. It's not entirely clear what. He's always upset about one thing or another. I recall when Secretary General to be Anders Fogh Rasmussen was about to come into office, Erdogan objected on the basis of the famous Danish newspaper cartoons about the Prophet Muhammad, and he wanted something, and it was worked out. So I think this is a bump in the road. I hope it's only a bump in the road because it would be very self-destructive and very much not in Turkey's interest to carry this much further. And I don't think it will be carried much further.
Let me move, Jose Maria Aznar, President. Let me move from NATO to the United Nations. We are watching right now something which is really terrible. We are watching how one of the members of the Security Council, one of the 5 members of the permanent members of the Security Council, one with veto, is violating systematically all the main rules of the international law of the Charter of the United Nations. How is the United Nations going to react? Which is the United Nations future in this respect? What are we going to, I mean, if you were a member of the Security Council, a permanent member of the Security Council, would you be sitting down together with Putin whenever the Security Council would be meeting?
Yeah, I understand very well your question, but the problem is that for this kind of questions, different in the past, for this kind of questions, I don't know. Would like to say exactly that to me, member of the Security Council is irrelevant, but the influence of the Security Council in the current crisis in the world are almost irrelevant. If you look in the intervention of the United Nations, unfortunately, in the current crisis, or the intervention of the decision of the Security Council in the current crisis, practically none exist. And you can ask publicly, if none exists in NATO, what happened? What happened? None exists in NATO. In NATO, all aggression is possible in any country. And the United Nations has not the capacity to stop this. Another question is if you can share a seat in the Security Council with a member that has violation of the United Nations Charter, or that invade another country, or not respect the sovereignty or the integrity of the country, or to provoke a war. This thing is totally unacceptable. But the situation of the United Nations, taking account the situation of different agencies of the United Nations, some agencies working, another no. Some agencies working reasonably, others no. But the situation of the United Nations as institution, and the Security Council in particular, but the key element of the United Nations, is in this moment, in my view, critical. And this is one of the reasons, because the reinforcement and the strengthening of NATO for us, for all of us, and as well for the world, is totally indispensable. I appreciate very much the words of Ambassador Bolton about my reflection and my proposal to extend NATO, to consider NATO a global organization. But I consider I keep in this position because I consider that the evolution of the world reinforces this idea that the NATO can be a global organization, and in a world defining for the consequences of technological revolution, and a world that is full of weapons with capacity of extraction that we cannot imagine in some decades ago, some years ago. In a world with a serious competition of powers, especially in some powers, China or Russia or Iran, in a world that is unstable, insecure, in disorder. To have to reinforce our organization with NATO is very important. If you look in, I have a member of that generation that have the privilege that never know a war in house, domestic war, or general war in Europe. It is true that we are looking the war in the Balkans, or now in Ukraine, but not the classic wars that we live in the last century, And we are living an exceptional period under the umbrella and under the American leadership. This is the truth. American leadership is challenging now, and now the response will be extremely important for all of us. But in this response, in this answer, the position of NATO will be key again in the future.
Let me ask you both, in a few days' time, at the end of the month of June, we are going to have the summit meeting of NATO here in Madrid, which is extremely important. It's extremely important because every 10 years, the summit meeting takes place, and certainly this is not any year in particular. This is the year where we are watching the best world situation that we've watched since the end of the Second World War. Do you think that, or do you decide, do you wish that the summit meeting would eventually consider that enlargement, that global enlargement of NATO all over the place, that it would consider in the strategic concept, the new strategic concept to be applied for the coming 10 years, that possibility of NATO becoming the global institution? Ambassador Bolton.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, I think this very opportune moment to consider a number of questions. I have a feeling that the temptation of the leaders at the Madrid summit will be to talk about Ukraine and Russia, and that's understandable and probably necessary. But I think we could consider, we could hope that they consider a number of other broader issues as well. Our leaders since February the 24th have talked a lot about how united NATO is. In fact, we know, sadly, that it's not as united as the rhetoric. We know that many countries in Europe in particular are still not contributing as much as they could, both in terms of their overall defense expenditures and really what they've provided to the Ukrainians. We have disputes within NATO about how to resolve this conflict with the Russians. We heard from President Zelensky a few days ago that President Macron of France had told him that Ukraine had to give up some territory to save face for Putin and end the war that way. We don't know exactly what words Zelensky used in response, but we know that he rejected that idea. So the questions of unity among the 30 NATO members now and soon to be 32, I think will be important, number one. Number two, the Ukraine crisis in many respects comes from a NATO failure not to address the question of how far it was prepared to expand. When the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union broke up, it's not true, as some people argue, that we pushed NATO's borders toward Russia. That's inaccurate. Countries of Central and Eastern Europe came to us and said, look, we want security, we want peace, we don't want to be part of something like the Warsaw Pact again. So NATO expanded for very good defensive reasons, but we left a gap. We left a gray zone between NATO's eastern border and Russia's western border. Belarus, Moldova, and Ukraine are one part of that. The Caucasus countries are another. The Asian republics are another. We looked at this question in 2008 at the Bucharest NATO summit when President Bush proposed to put Ukraine and Georgia on a fast track for NATO membership. That was rejected. 4 months later, the Russians invaded Georgia, and the rest we know. What is going to be our position going forward on constituent parts of the former Soviet Union that want to join the NATO alliance. We didn't resolve it, and we got 2014 the invasion of Ukraine #1, and 2022 the second invasion of Ukraine. We can't afford to make that mistake again. And then third, I really do think whatever specific countries we may want to consider in Asia and elsewhere in the world, that NATO's part in that larger world has got to be considered. You know, in 2019, I think it was President Bolsonaro of Brazil said that he wanted Brazil to join NATO. Now that didn't go very far, but it was certainly a very interesting suggestion. And I think that if we ignore this global issue, we will be doing ourselves a disservice. You know, the first invocation of Article 5 was because of the attack on the United States that emanated from Afghanistan, and it was one of NATO's, I think, great achievements. What happened with the destruction of the Taliban regime and all the work that all NATO members did in Afghanistan in the succeeding 20 years. I think it's a tragic mistake that the US and NATO withdrew from Afghanistan. And to me, it just highlights why this question of security, peace and security for the North Atlantic area can't be viewed in isolation. And so this upcoming summit, I think, could be a forum not to resolve all the issues. I think that's not possible, but certainly to begin a more serious discussion than we've had to date, I think could be very important.
Thank you. I sincerely agree with Ambassador Bolton. But I must I want to remember that in the prior summit that we celebrated in Madrid, 1997, the first in the unique summit so far in Spain, we approved several important questions for us. Now, first of all, the presence of Spain in the military structure of NATO that put end a very strange position of Spain in the organization. And second, we approve as well the first enlargement of NATO after the Cold War. The first enlargement in favor of Czechia, Hungary, and Poland. That then was confirmed for the summit in Washington. And then, and more, we approve the special relationship and the partenariat between Ukraine and NATO. This is important, record that, because this is begin as well in a summit in Madrid. But I share the ideas of Ambassador Bolton, and I consider that Madrid was decisive to extend NATO to Finland, to Sweden. That is very two important countries, new countries in the NATO. Consider the current situation in Ukraine. Define and confirm a clear strategy to defeat this initiative from Mr. Putin, is this military initiative for Russia, and establish the conditions in NATO that NATO is converted in a guarantee to eliminate any temptation in any country to intervene, to invade other countries and to break the sovereignty and the integrity of these countries. For me, this is very important.
Yeah, you are both absolutely right, and I completely agree with you. As a matter of fact, I was one of the negotiators of the Helsinki Final Act, and I remember very well that one of the principles, the first principle, and that was, you have to remember, but that was approved in 1975. The first principle introduced a principle which is very clear, is that all the participating states, which certainly at the time included of the 35 initial states, and then all the others who joined later, have the right to belong to all the international agreements and have the right to belong or not to belong to treaties of alliance. This is one of the things that Russia is violating again, against their own compromises. And President Aznar is absolutely right. The 1997 summit meeting in Madrid on the NATO was extremely important for us because, as he pointed out, was the moment when we closed the whole process of integration into NATO through the military integration. That was something which was not done before. We have to remember that thing. And at the same time, it did introduce the possibility of all the former socialist members of the Warsaw Pact to become members of NATO, applying the same principle. Because after all, when the Russians are telling us that NATO is attacking, trying to attack the Soviet, well, I wouldn't say the Soviet Union right now, but the Russian Federation, is not true. It's basically not true. All those countries, like we did in the past, are looking for their own defense of their own values and principles and democratic values. So
more or less, more even, Ambassador Perez, if you let me, in the next summit in 1999 that was in Washington, that this is the expression of anniversary of the foundation of NATO. In the meeting, in the summit, there is seated in the meeting 5 former members of the Politburo of the Soviet Union. You can compare. This is the question that the Ambassador Bolton said prior. Okay, one question is that the NATO have a strategy and decided the strategy to expand the borders of NATO until the doors of the borders of Russia. Another thing is the freedom of the country that is, hey, I want to be member of NATO. But in this summit in Washington, I share this table with my colleagues of the US, my colleagues, but 5 former members of the Politburo of the Soviet Union. It's totally false that the attitude of the United States, of the NATO, was to try to not incorporate, eliminate, or force to Russia, or threaten Russia or his friends of Russia to as a threat, or consider NATO a very serious threat for them. It is totally untrue, and this is a part of history.
Now, let me ask you something which is very much in today's world worried, which is how are we going to reach a reasonable peace as far as the Russian aggression against the Ukraine is concerned? How do you see the possibilities of reaching what I would call, and insist, a reasonable peace, not any peace? We are not back to Chamberlain, we are not back to the Sudeten, we are not back to Hitler. So which are the rules, which are the principles that we should be following, that NATO should be following, that the NATO members should be following, just to achieve a real peace for now and for the future? Ambassador, you have the floor.
Well, one thing to consider is that at the beginning of the Russian invasion, it was the very widely held view, certainly it was the view of U.S. intelligence, which they briefed Congress on, that Russian forces would take Kiev within a matter of days and the whole country within a matter of weeks. So it wasn't just the Russians who underestimated Ukraine's resolve or overestimated their own capabilities. And in those early days, the first, let's say, 4, 6, 8 weeks of the war, we and other NATO members were simply trying to get assistance to Ukraine to prevent defeat, to prevent the country from being overrun through a variety of means. But now we can see that Russian capabilities are nothing like what we thought. The war is not at a stalemate yet, but it's marked by very little progress from the Russian side, which is important. But I don't think collectively, I speak for the United States, certainly, I don't think the government has now a new set of objectives in mind, given these changed circumstances. People talk about victory very loosely. You know, it's the position of the United States, and has been since the 2014 invasion, that Ukraine is entitled to full sovereignty over its territory as it was created at the time of the breakup of the Soviet Union. Do we really expect President Zelensky to give up some of that territory? I think he'd be hard pressed not to say he wants ceded back to Ukraine what was taken in 2014. So to me, this is a very difficult question. I don't think Putin has any incentive to negotiate because he's got to do something to repair the reputational damage that the Russian military has suffered. So he has no incentive to negotiate. I don't think Zelensky has any incentive either. I find it hard, if not impossible, to believe that he would somehow find some piece of Ukraine he was willing to give to the Russians. So I think we've got to look very seriously about what NATO is prepared to insist upon from Russia. And we've come so far in such a relatively quick period of time. The military situation has evolved so quickly that I think many countries are not thinking in those terms. I don't think the United States is to start. So that's something we have to look at when we talk about victory for NATO, for Ukraine. We can certainly say not being defeated. That was the easy part. But how do we define what comes next? And specifically, are we willing simply to go back to the status quo antebellum before this latest invasion? I think the answer to that's clearly not. But how much more can we reasonably expect to achieve? That is a key issue that leaders have to address.
Would you consider that Putin should be brought to the International Criminal Court and submitted to trial? Would you consider?
Well, I'm not a fan of the International Criminal Court for a whole range of reasons. We could discuss that at a separate conference. In
that particular case, would you consider the possibility of creating a new Nuremberg just to bring him to trial?
Well, I think the real answer to how to make Putin accountable is a different kind of government in Russia. And real accountability, real responsibility would be the Russian people holding him to account for what he's done in their name. Now, I don't think we have collectively addressed what comes after Putin or whether that's possible. I think many people have had overly optimistic ideas about the Russian people somehow getting a new government. I don't see that in the near term. But what are we as NATO, and particularly for those in Europe, for the United States, really on a global basis, do we consider a post-war Russia led by Putin to be just another normal country? Are we just going to turn the page and go back to business as usual, which I think some in both the United States and Europe want for business and commercial reasons? I just find that very hard to believe. So I think we all need to do some very serious thinking. I don't think the status quo antebellum is acceptable. But I also know there are many, especially in Europe, that really don't see much beyond going back to that period. So we better have this discussion now. Before you can negotiate seriously, you have to know what your objectives are. And I don't think collectively we can say at this point we have an answer to that.
President Aznar, how do you see it?
No, I understand the people when they say Putin is a war criminal and must be convicted and subject to a trial in the international court. Well, but prior all these questions, if you think this, you must to defeat Putin. If you want to organize another Nuremberg, you must defeat the enemies, because if not, it's impossible. And the question is, what means exactly defeated Putin? How means exactly defeated this strategic initiative, military, defeated totally the initiative of the Russian military, trying to put apart Putin on the leadership of Russia leadership. What means this? I think I understand very clear what is the strategic defeat that we needed in this crisis. I understand perfectly all the questions related with territorial integrity. I understand perfect all the questions relating with allies unity that we must to preserve. I understand the necessity to witness seriously the military capabilities of Russia. I understand perfectly the necessity of reinforced NATO. But the definition of the what means defeated Putin is on the table. And I am sure the some people, can share the idea that it's better that they continue in this situation to negotiate with Mr. Putin. If you are negotiating with Mr. Putin, all the consideration of Mr. Putin that in the terms of the criminal court and so on, I think is part of another war. No? I think the war will be long, will be a long war, and we must to win this war. Ukrainian must to win this war, and Ukrainian with us must to win this war. And this means the strategic defeat of Mr. Putin. This is my answer until today.
Are you considering or thinking about the possibility of further participation of the Western world, NATO, the United States, in the war? Are you considering the possibility that at some point or other we could end up in the Third World War? Are you considering the possibility, as Putin has mentioned several times, that nuclear war could be there? That he's been threatening all of us with. Do you see that possibility as one of the possibilities in the near future? Or do you see some sort of arrangement bringing the war to an end, and at the same time, all those responsible for the war to some sort of responsibility? Because at the end of the day, we cannot sort of imagine a world after Ukraine as if nothing had happened. How do you see these possibilities right now?
Well, I don't really see a possibility at this juncture of Russia using nuclear weapons. I think Putin has been bluffing on this point. I think he's trying to deter us, and he's had some measure of success, unfortunately. I don't think it's serious until Russia's in complete retreat out of Ukraine, possibly the Ukrainians moving toward the Russian border, which would be a regime-threatening circumstance for Putin himself. But I think we also need to understand how deeply we're in this conflict already, not just the provision of weapons and ammunition, but the provision of intelligence that has materially assisted the Ukrainians in their efforts in a whole variety of fields. So if Putin wanted justification or a pretext for responding to NATO, as he sometimes talks about, he's basically already got it. And I think that's why the Baltic republics, Poland, and others are so worried, and why in the days in late 2021, we should have taken this threat of a Russian invasion more seriously. Let's be clear, our greatest failure is that we failed to deter the invasion to begin with. So if we want peace and security in Europe, you cannot allow countries to commit unprovoked aggression against their neighbors and escape essentially into a world where you can turn the page and everybody forgets that it happened. We've made that mistake too many times before. I find it hard to believe actual NATO military forces would be involved, but that's something we should be thinking about once hostilities cease. If Ukraine's not going to become a NATO member, what are we going to do to make sure that a future Putin doesn't decide he's got a better plan than Putin did, and we go through this all over again?
President Aznar.
Yeah. In my view, in this moment, I think clearly there is no room for any kind of negotiation. But and the risk is the extension of the war. But this risk exists. This possibility exists. And did you tell me maybe Ambassador Bolton in general has the reason when he said that the threat from Putin to use a nuclear weapon is a bluff? Maybe. Except in the case of an existential threat for Russia. In this case, my view, my personal view, is that the possibility that use this nuclear weapon exists. And with the logical of Mr. Putin, implacable logical of Mr. Putin, this threat exists. And but we should react, and this possibility not with panic, but very different than the beginning of this crisis. But I don't know if John Bolton is agree with me, but I understand that at the beginning of this crisis, we said Putin, guy, you non-invade, no organized invasion of Ukraine. But if you invade Ukraine, our response will be establish sanctions against you, but not confronting directed with you. And Putin made his calculus and said, okay, I organized the invasion. This was a mistake that with us improving the situation of the commitment of NATO, and we helped Ukrainians. No? And this is one of the reasons, because I think that Mr. Putin thought in the moment that his presence in Kiev in 48 hours changed the regime in his favor. But this possibility exists. And the response of the NATO on one of the reasons, important questions in the Madrid summit, will be establish a clear response of any threat of use nuclear weapons for Mr. Putin. Establish a clear threat, a very clear strategy, a clear response to this threat. Because if not, the combination can be the same at the beginning of the crisis. Well, the Western countries, the NATO, talking, said a lot of things, but finally don't respond to this. Well, this consideration must be in the table of the summit in Madrid, maybe.
Both of you, friends, Jose Maria, John, we've reached the time we have originally allotted to ourselves, but I'm sure that we have the right and almost the obligation to say a few words. And I would like to listen from you, your remarks in that respect. Certainly, this is a conversation we should be going on and on and on, because after all, we are talking is the peace in the world and the rights of the people to live freely in peace. We might eventually think through FAES and through Jose María Aznar the continuation of this conversation. But for the time being, I would like to invite you, both of you, to say a final remarks on this today's dialogue. John.
Well, I would say I'm very optimistic. It's a time of tragedy in Ukraine because of the Russian aggression, but it's I think, in the history of nations, typically when you confront great challenges, that opportunities flow from them, and it reminds people what our basic values are. And certainly in the case of NATO, it reminds us why we banded together in the first place, and why bringing new members in shows the continued importance of the organization. So despite the breadth of the challenges we face around the world, I think it's this kind of adrenaline that gives us confidence that we can respond effectively, and we can create circumstances that deter our adversaries from beginning future wars to begin with.
José María Aznar.
I personally believe in the formidable power of freedom, and the power of freedom has been in the history of the world the most important tool in our hands. And I think that finally this power of freedom will going to prevail as well in this crisis.
Well, thank you very much to you both. Certainly, it was really fantastic to listen to both of you, and at the same time, there are really quite a number of foods for thought in what we've been discussing. I would like to end up saying that at the end of the day, I would like to recover some sense of the universal organization that used to be the United Nations, just to prevent mankind from the threat of war. But certainly we are looking and we are watching right now difficult moments. And as John Bolton pointed out, I'm still an optimistic in spite of everything. Thank you very much to you both. It's been such a pleasure. On behalf of myself, on behalf of FAES Foundation, on behalf of the president of this wonderful foundation, FAES, who is today with us, José María Aznar. And thank you to you all who both from both sides of the Atlantic have been following this wonderful dialogue. Goodbye now.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you very much.